Thank you, Ed. Yes, as Ed's introduced, I worked with Scientists One in Europe for the last few months, helping to arrange this week of talks that you are welcome to join us with. We have a talk today by Helen Harwatt for our Food Day, but briefly, just a quick introduction to my interest and my involvement with the charity. As a graduate of environmental scientists myself, coming from Liverpool, the two warnings, the second and third, the warning of climate emergency came out whilst I was in education, and the six sort of stresses that were emphasised in that were very apparent in my literature that I was learning about at the time. And so when the opportunity arose to become involved with such a brilliant organisation and speak with just a plethora of renowned scientists such as Helen herself today, I could not refuse. And just briefly to introduce, again, you may have been with us for one of the previous talks today, but just to read the food section from the second warning, the World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency released in 2017, I'll just introduce for a bit of context. Eating mostly plant-based foods while reducing the global consumption of animal products, especially ruminant livestock, can improve human health and significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions, including methane in the short-lived pollutant steppe. Moreover, this will free up croplands for growing much-needed human plant food instead of livestock feed, whilst releasing some grazing land to support natural climate solutions. Cropping practices, such as minimal tillage that increase soil carbon, are vitally important. We need to drastically reduce the enormous amount of food waste around the world. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Helen Harwatt. Just a brief background: as an environmental social scientist, she achieved her PhD in the University of Leeds and has held numerous research positions around both Leeds, Loma Linda University, and currently in Harvard Law, where she focuses on food systems' effect on many of the areas that we focus on in the Sustainable Development Goals and here at Scientists One in Europe. Her talk today and the focus of today's panel is restoring native ecosystems on spared agricultural land. And it's my pleasure to introduce Helen and hand over to you for today's talk.
Brilliant. Thanks, Johnny, and thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. So I'm just going to share my screen and take you through some of the research that I've been doing in this area. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the research we've done, a lot of we do on restoring ecosystems on spared agricultural land. So I'll give a little bit of background on why we're even looking at restoring native ecosystems, and also some more background on where that spared, or how that spared agricultural land would actually come about. So just a very brief overview on climate change, because I'm sure you're all very knowledgeable in that area already. So of course, it's one of the most severe issues, and this is also recognized by the World Health Organization, which I think is a very important point to bear in mind, that we're not just talking about this as an environmental issue on its own. This is actually a major global public health issue as well. Of course, we have the Paris Agreement that we are committed to keeping well below 2 degrees, ideally to no more than 1.5 degrees. I think the really important part in that is the 1.5 degrees, which is really only there because of the small island states that really pushed for that inclusion. Otherwise, it would just be well below 2 degrees. So the background context for this is that the G20 members account for really the biggest bulk of global greenhouse gas emissions. Global average temperature has already risen above 1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it's already having negative impacts. The latest report from the IPCC found that the impacts at 1.5 degrees would be greater than at current, but not as bad as if we go up to 2 degrees. So there's definitely a trajectory there in terms of what impacts we expect to see in relation to that temperature rise. They also found that the impacts would be greater if we allow temperature to go above 1.5 degrees and then bring that back down to 1.5 degrees at some point this century. And that's because of a range of tipping points that have been termed tipping points in the literature. So this example by a group of leading environmental scientists, they found that there are a range of major ecosystems that could basically be tipped into unstable, uncertain states at certain temperature bands. So those yellow ones there you can see are within the 1 to 3 degrees temperature range. So we could be looking at severely destabilizing or even losing major ice sheets, and 3 to 5 degrees, which is really the temperature that we're currently aiming towards with the current greenhouse gas emissions trajectories. So we're then talking about also losing major forest systems as well, such as the boreal and the Amazon rainforest. So really the best option within the context of the Paris Agreement, at least, is to adhere to the precautionary principle of the Paris Agreement and the equity component of the Paris Agreement, which is really important and really not discussed enough. So that would basically require sticking to 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. To do this would require a 45% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. So that's really less than 10 years to almost half emissions. So that is a very major task in itself, and extending to net zero by 2050. So this means basically whatever we emit in 2050 should be taken down or sequestered from the atmosphere elsewhere somehow. So the progress report is pretty grim. I mean, I've got to say that a lot of this content is pretty grim, but I guess you're quite aware of the situation. But I think hopefully by the end, we will be more hopeful in terms of the solutions. So the progress report, greenhouse gas emissions have risen by around 1.5% in the last decade. So this is over a period where we should be seeing peaks and reductions. CO2 from energy use in industry hit a record high in 2018. Current pledges to the Paris Agreement, as I said, currently take us above 3 degrees, above industrial levels. On the current trajectory, the chances of meeting the Paris goals could actually be depleted as soon as 2030. So this coming year is really important. So in this coming year, countries are revising what they commit to actually doing under the Paris Agreement. And those revisions are really the final opportunity to bring emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the coming decade and even the coming year really is absolutely crucial for climate change mitigation. So what we actually need is for countries to increase ambitions fivefold to align with the 1.5 degrees goal, or threefold for the 2 degrees. We need emissions to peak as soon as possible. So that would be this year for the 1.5 degrees goal, and followed by strong and rapid reductions before 2030, in addition to enhanced longer term commitments. So basically, if we delay action now, we are putting a much greater dependence on unproven technologies to remove emissions from the atmosphere at some point in the future. So in order to avoid that strong reliance on technology in the future, we need to reduce emissions steeply up to 2030 and really stick to those emissions budgets. And just to briefly give a little overview of the emissions budget. So the IPCC calculated in 2018 what the global CO2 budget would be to give us a 66% chance of staying below or at 1.5 degrees. So this was 420 gigatons of CO2. So if we take off what we've actually emitted since then, this brings us around 335 gigatons. So this is equal to less than 10 years of current emissions for the entire 1.5 degrees budget. And something that's really important to this, to the context of this talk, is that in addition to sticking to this budget, which requires deep and rapid reductions of emissions on the ground, we also have to remove massive amounts of emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So this requires large areas of land to do that, whichever method we really look at. And just to briefly talk through some of those methods for actually taking emissions from the atmosphere. So this is essential to do for the 1.5 degrees goal and most likely needed for 2 degrees as well. Like I said, all of these methods require large areas of land. So we have some of the high-tech options such as bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So we're basically growing biofuels such as miscanthus, transferring them to power stations, burning them and capturing the gases before they're released to the atmosphere, scrubbing out the CO2 and burying that underground in some disused geological formations. As you can imagine, this technology doesn't exist right now at the scale that it's needed and may never exist. So this is a major risk. And what's probably even more alarming is that many climate change mitigation plans really heavily rely on this technology in the future to actually achieve those emissions reductions. So this is microbes in the soil or biochar in the soil. And really the only option that we actually have right now at the scale needed is as simple as regrowing vegetation. So things such as reforestation, for example. Of course, this also requires large areas of land to do that. So we need to look at what land we could actually use in order to reforest on the scale needed to actually achieve those carbon sequestration goals. So agriculture is the biggest land user globally right now. Animal agriculture specifically uses the bulk of that land, so 83% of the agricultural land. And if we look at the sort of efficiency of that use, it's actually very low. So in exchange for 83% of our agricultural land, animal agriculture delivers 8% of calories and 37% of protein for global consumption. Conversely, crops use 17% of agricultural land and provide 82% of calories and 63% of protein for global consumption. So food production is also a major contributor to past deforestation. So it's a direct driver around 80% worldwide. Again, animal agriculture has a disproportionate impact here and is responsible for around 65% of all land use change since 1960. And is also linked to around 80% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. Of course, forests are a really important natural carbon sink. And as I said, that's really all we have right now. We don't have any sort of artificial means of capturing and storing carbon, so we really need these natural sinks. And they're also really important areas for biodiversity as well, which is a separate issue, but also very related in that it basically helps to provide a functioning ecosystem, which is really essential. So we have this sort of legacy of animal agriculture being a major contributor to the loss of carbon sinks, as well as still occupying the bulk of that agricultural land. So in addition to the demand for animal products increasing, really why they actually use all of that land is because they're so inefficient to produce. So for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef actually requires 37 calories of plants to produce. Pork requires 12 calories, chicken requires 9, and eggs and dairy each require 6 calories. Globally, a third of all crop calories are fed to farmed animals, and only around 12% of those calories come back as human edible food. So we're losing over a third of all calories produced before it gets to anybody's plate. So this is a major source of food waste that we don't currently account for in the same way that we look at, say, post-consumer food waste. So it's really much more efficient for us to just eat plants directly. An example of this is a study published in 2018. So they looked at the US, which currently uses 67% of all calories produced for livestock feed. And what they found is that by reconfiguring that crop production and instead growing foods that optimize for human health and least resources, they could actually feed twice as many people from that same area of land. We also need to look at, well, what if we don't do anything about agricultural emissions? Is that an option? So one example is from an article I published in 2018. And what I found is that if we don't take any action on livestock and it continues under business as usual, by 2030, it would actually use around half of the budget for the 1.5 degrees goal and around 37% of the budget for the 2 degrees goal. So this is by 2030. So we can reduce livestock emissions to an extent through technological measures, but the actual benefits, somewhere around 10% reduction is the latest estimate, is just really not enough it's really not going to get us the reductions that we need from that sector, basically. So reducing the consumption of animal products is absolutely unavoidable. And if we don't do that, it basically requires other sectors to massively increase their mitigation efforts beyond anything which is planned or realistic. So we need radical action far beyond anything that's currently planned across all sectors, including agriculture. So I think it's really important to stress here that what I'm talking about and the results that I'm going to show are not a standalone measure. So we still need every other sector to do everything that they can as well. So in our analysis, we focus on the carbon dioxide removal potential of returning some of the land use for animal agriculture back to its native vegetation cover. So in this case, that was either forest or grassland. Again, we focus on animal agriculture because of its current large land occupation, its large historical contribution to the loss of natural carbon sinks, and its low food output to land use ratio. So this is really a kind of obvious first port of call to look at in terms of these shifts. And so this is an article that we published in at the end of September. And this is basically what I'm going to just briefly run through now. So we posed 3 main research questions. So first of all, we wanted to know how much agricultural land could be restored to native vegetation cover. And in doing that, how much carbon could we actually remove from the atmosphere? And what impact might these shifts have on food production? And it's worth pointing out, if it wasn't obvious already, that we're really modeling deep transformations to agriculture here, and we're really not considering business as usual or attempting to maintain business as usual in any way. So our scenarios, first of all, we returned permanent pasture and animal feed cropland to forest. So this really gives us the current carbon opportunity cost of animal agriculture. So as I said, agriculture on deforested land and continuing to be on deforested land is basically preventing that vegetation from restoring. Therefore, there's an opportunity cost there in terms of the carbon sequestration potential. So that was our first step to actually look at that opportunity cost. And secondly, we looked at 3 different dietary scenarios and the carbon dioxide removal potential of each of those 3 scenarios. So we looked at a business as usual, we looked at an eat lancet, and we looked at a vegan diet. So just to briefly run through the methodology. So there were 4 main points. So the first 2 were really to map out globally. So we did a spatial mapping exercise of where all of the crops were currently distributed. So this was for 175 crops. And we basically used existing data sets from the literature and just sort of mapped them in new ways in order to do this analysis. So we took the FAO's definition of permanent pasture land. So this is any land used for grazing for 5 years for more than 100 days per year. So this is not going to include all land that's currently used for animal grazing. And we did this at a resolution of around 9 by 5 kilometers, sorry. So then we mapped out where the crops are being grown for direct human consumption versus animal feed crops, again using existing data sets from the literature. And then we mapped the carbon content of vegetation. So again, using existing data sets. So we had 6 global data sets for the carbon that would basically naturally occur if that land use was abandoned. So if we abandoned pasture pasture farming, animal farming on that pasture land, then this is basically the carbon that would occur in that situation. So the average time frame that we assumed was around 30 years to actually achieve the maximum carbon sequestration potential. And it's worth pointing out that we measured the carbon existing already in pasture and cropland. So what we present is actually additional to what is already there in that land. So for the dietary scenarios, we looked at 3 scenarios. So again, we used the existing data, the business as usual. We mapped the cropland expansion per continent and the pasture expansion of 6% from the literature by 2050. For the Eat Lancet diet, again, we used the recent guidelines from the published literature, and the feed crops and pasture land using crop and forage estimates. Sorry. So sorry, just had a slight technical issue. In the vegan diet, this in this scenario, we have all of the permanent pasture land taken out of production, plus the feed croplands, minus the cropland that would actually be needed to provide the macronutrients to replace those animal source foods. So this actually also factors in waste, so around 25% losses and waste, and also takes into account the variation in nutritional requirements among different demographics and for disparities in food availability. So we're basically not just modeling one kind of standard vegan diet and assuming that everyone in the world will be able to grow and consume that. So it's actually quite specific to those requirements. So this is a map of the carbon opportunity cost. So this is basically showing the density of vegetation. So this green chart here, the darkest green is the most dense carbon sequestration. So those dark green bits are where we would expect to see the most carbon sequestration. And this is on all land currently occupied, well, all permanent pasture land and all feed cropland. And essentially what we found is the carbon opportunity cost of that is around 153 gigatons of carbon. So around 72% of this amount comes from pasture land, and around 28% of that carbon would be sequestered on disused feed cropland. So it's worth pointing out here that we didn't actually include emission savings of methane or nitrous oxide. So we're mainly just focusing, or we're only focusing on carbon in our analysis, but obviously those would be additional benefits as well. And they have already been quantified elsewhere, such as the Eat Lancet analysis. So we also looked at the what this looks like by region. So we basically split that out into these 4 different country income types. And we found that 70% of that sequestration potential that you could see on that map actually occurs in the high and upper middle income countries. So if we think back to the beginning where we could see the G20 emit around 78% of CO2, I think there's quite a strong link in there in terms of the high and upper middle income countries really taking a lead on these sorts of measures. And our results certainly indicate that there is a massive potential there for them to do that. So this is roughly split between cropland and pasture land in high income countries. So these boxes here, and around 70% from rewilding pasture land in upper middle income countries. So we also looked at the 3 dietary scenarios, And as you can see here, the business as usual. So this is basically if we carry on as usual up to 2050, feeding around 10 billion, we would actually need to expand cropland. And this was actually using optimistic yield assumptions for crops. And we still have to expand cropland and actually increase the greenhouse gas or carbon opportunity costs of agriculture going forward. Under the Eat Lancet diet, we could sequester around 332 gigatons of CO2, which is equivalent to around 9 years of current fossil fuel emissions. And under the vegan diet, where we have no animal source products, we sequester the most, and that would be around 547 gigatons of CO2. And just in case anybody doesn't know, the Eat Lancet diet is around 70% meat reduction compared to business as usual scenario. So how does this relate? As I said, the Lancet is equivalent to around 9 years of fossil fuel emissions and equal to around CO2 budget. The vegan diet extends this to 16 years and is equal to around 163% of the remaining CO2 budget. I don't think we should actually see this as kind of offsetting the need for action in other areas. So we shouldn't really consider it as extending the budget. It's just sort of an equivalent to give you an idea of what that actually means. And overall, this would actually make agriculture a net negative sector where it's currently a net positive emitter. So we also did this analysis for the UK. So I'll just briefly run through, or a similar analysis for the UK using the exact same method. So we actually published this ahead of the journal article. And this analysis, we looked at returning permanent pasture and animal feed croplands to forest. So this would be temperate forest in the UK. So this scenario maximizes the carbon dioxide removal, but might not meet micronutrient needs because we are using some of that cropland. So in the second scenario, we just looked at returning permanent pasture land to forest. So what we found is that the UK has currently around 40% of all land in the UK is used for animal agriculture, and 55% of all our cropland in the UK is used for animal feed. So this is what that looks like spatially. So at the top here, again, the darkest colouring is the greatest density of pasture land in this case. So we can see how that is spread spatially throughout the UK. And then down here we have all of the cropland. So it's roughly a sort of east-west split going on. And 55% of all this cropland is used for animal feed currently. In England, that's 56%. In Scotland, it's 49%. Wales, it's 49%. And in Northern Ireland, 58% of their cropland is used for animal feed crops. So in the first scenario, this would be the remaining, the cropland currently used for feed crops that would actually be returned to forest. And in this is the cropland that would be kept under food crops, and that alone would actually would provide enough calories and protein for the UK population. We didn't actually look at micronutrient needs, so we can't say anything about whether it would be sufficient in that regard. So in this scenario, this is what that would look like, especially again with the darkest green representing the densest, the most dense sequestration or the most vegetation cover. And that would remove around 4.4 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere under that scenario over the 30-year period. So most of this, around 73% of that amount, would actually come from restoring or reforesting pasture land, and around 27% from reforesting cropland. So the second scenario, where we just reforest the pasture land, we would have all of this cropland here remaining for human edible crop production. So it just looked a little bit washed out on this graphic. So I just wanted to assure you that there was plenty of cropland in all of these other countries, and we're not just growing the crops in England. So this scenario of reforesting permanent pastureland in the UK would remove around 3.2 billion tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere. And around 43% of that sequestration would occur from lands reforested in England, 32% in Scotland, 15% in Wales, and 10% in Northern Ireland. So how does this relate to UK climate goals? So in our first scenario, where we reforest permanent pasture and cropland, that would remove the equivalent of around 12 years of UK CO2 emissions and would essentially double the 1.5 degree budget up to 2050, and would also meet the shortfall in relation to the zero emissions target. More than meet the shortfall, sorry. So now a second scenario where we have permanent pasture returned back to forest, this would remove the equivalent of around 9 years of UK CO2 emissions from the atmosphere up to 2050, up to 2050, or a 30-year time frame, would increase the 1.5 degree budget by around 75% and would meet the bulk of the zero emissions shortfall. And again, these scenarios would actually make UK agriculture a net negative emitter from its current net positive state. So there are a whole range of different potential co-benefits from these scenarios. So basically, if we shift some of that feed cropland to human edible crops, we could help address the really low consumption of fruits and vegetables in the UK and high consumption of red and processed meats, which is a leading mortality risk factor in the UK. It could also help to meet increasing demand for plant-based foods and provide new opportunities for producers and farmers. There's a whole range of environmental benefits as well. As I said, we didn't actually measure the non-CO2 methane and nitrous oxide, but that would definitely be a major benefit of such a shift. We'd also expect to see a reduction in nutrient pollution. So for example, in the UK, pastures are the biggest user of nitrogen application. So we definitely expect to see a reduction in terms of nutrient pollution. We would also expect to see catchment areas restored to the extent that the forest would actually act as a flood defense again and filter water out to actually prevent flooding further downstream, or at least reduce that level of flooding. And obviously we have potentially lots of new habitat for wildlife restorations and reintroductions. So in the UK, we have a major biodiversity issue. So 15% are currently threatened with extinction. We already have 133 that are extinct, and agriculture has had the single largest impact in recent decades. And that's actually true globally as well. So this isn't just specific to the UK. What is specific to the UK is that it has a really low level of forest cover already. So any kind of movement towards these sort of reforestation scenarios would be very positive in that respect as well. And we also have new opportunities for landowners and recreation opportunities for the public. So I think this aspect is actually not something that we really talk about that much when we think about these kind of shifts, but I think it's really important when we think about the sort of well-being benefits that could actually arise from having much greater access to nature. So these are really quite significant benefits that are being quantified in the literature. So we definitely need to bear these sort of impacts in mind. So I think another really interesting aspect of these sort of shifts as well is to try and imagine what this would actually look like on the ground. So we have the numbers and we can put them into the context of CO2 budgets and how that would help by 2050 and so on, but what would it actually be like to experience? And I don't have an example from the UK, but I do have one from Oregon State. So this is Hart Mountain in Oregon State, where they essentially did rewilding just by removing cattle from the ground. So I'm just going to play this 2-minute video clip just to give a glimpse of this kind of transformation that we're talking about.
The only thing the managers did was remove the cattle. And then we just stand back and watch what happens. Aspen and willows are streamside biodiversity indicators. These woody plants connect with the birds you can hear, the understory shrubs and flowers. It's just incredible to see this. When the cattle were here in these meadows, the aspen would stay about this tall. They would be eating the small branches and the leaves. All the cattle were removed in 1990, and then we got this incredible flush of aspen here. So we have these young ones that are less than 25 years old, and then in contrast, we have these very large old ones that are just on their way out. This is about a 70 centimeter diameter aspen tree. Originated in the 1800s, before livestock arrived on Hart Mountain. This one here is 2.2 centimeters diameter. This came in about 10 years ago. We've taken some photographs since the cows have come off and compared those to what the willow looked like with the cows on the refuge. And it's just night and day. Just an incredible flush of willow and aspen all through this streamside area. It's quite a spectacle to see how nature can recover if it's just left on its own, how it can restore itself.
So of course those fauna and flora were very specific to that case study, but I think it's useful to just demonstrate and to bear that in mind what we're actually talking about. So of course we need to talk about the urgency of the situation and what solutions are needed, but I think we also need to really start sharing this vision of what that kind of future experience could be. So just to wrap up, so we've seen in the presentation that animal agriculture is a leading cause of land use change and is still a major land user in exchange for relatively little contribution to global nutrition. Repurposing animal agriculture land to forest or grassland makes a substantial contribution to climate goals and creating a Paris-compliant food system. And these are needed in addition to strong and rapid reductions in the short term. So as I said earlier, we can't just basically rely on any one sector to achieve all of the reductions needed. This is across sector. Everything has to change. And the shift offers multiple co-benefits to climate ecosystems and human health. So repurposing agricultural land in this way must be undertaken immediately in order to reduce the risk of these tipping points that we looked at early on, and also to avoid the reliance on other kind of currently unproven technologies that may never actually exist in the future to actually remove emissions in the future. So it really is a way for us to reduce the risk early on as well. And I think what our research shows is that animal agriculture is certainly not just a methane issue. And I think that's really precluded it to some extent from being sort of a focus of climate discussions if we just think of it as a methane or nitrous oxide issue, because of course the current discussions are very much focused on CO2. And I think this kind of analysis really shows that animal agriculture really needs to be actually quite central in those CO2 discussions as well. So governments need to include this kind of shift in their revised commitments over the next year that they will be making to the Paris Agreement. And not only that, but these policies really need to be done in a comprehensive way so that we're basically optimizing for climate, ecosystem and human health benefits across the board in one policy. And I was asked how this would sort of, or how it could look among policymakers and corporations and consumers. So I've just put a few ideas. Obviously we have the NDCs, which could be a central way for policymakers to actually implement these shifts. But we also have a lot of stuff going on at the national level. So we have food health, farming, biodiversity, environmental policies where these shifts could actually come in for implementation. And of course, we have the more obvious things such as shifting subsidies and providing incentives to land users to actually implement these shifts. We have a potential role for corporations in this, which some of you might shudder at and think corporations should have less of a role in the food system, but actually some of the partnerships that we're seeing with farmers to actually assist them to transition their production to either restoring to native vegetation or from shifting feed crops to food crops could actually be really important, especially in those early stages to actually get these shifts moving. The food industry could also increase its availability and accessibility of plant-based options. So instead of making this a sort of high-end, it's only kind of accessible to the high-end on the consumer spectrum, actually just make these options available to everybody. They could also commit to sales targets. I think Tesco might have done this recently, where they actually have a sales target for plant-based products, or alternatively in a sort of dining hall setting, they could actually commit to having a default vegan menu. Consumers, of course, we can all eat more plants. That's an option. We could also request changes in our kind of food environment. So where we eat and shop, we could actually request to see an increase in plant-based offerings. We could contact our political representatives, and we could also contribute to public consultation. So I don't think any of these are really new, but it just kind of demonstrates that there are a lot of different ways that these kind of shifts could happen going forward. And yeah, just to finish with, of course, we all know that this is increasingly an urgent issue. And with those savings that I presented, that was actually a 30-year timeframe. So it's really crucial for these kind of shifts to happen sooner rather than later, given that sort of 30-year period to actually achieve those carbon sequestration amounts. And just to finish, the results that the analyses that I presented are available in full. So this is the UK analysis. You can download that full report there. And the global analysis, this is a read version that you can access online as well. And that's it. So thanks so much. I think we're going to have time for a few questions, but thanks so much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Helen. That was absolutely brilliant. A very convincing talk indeed. Just before we do get onto the Q&A, while we still have everyone here with us, can I quickly thank Pucker Herbs for sponsoring our conference today, and also invite everyone in today's chat for tomorrow's Population Day, where we have two talks going on at 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And so you can reach them on our website. And now, yeah, Helen, if you'd kindly join us for a quick Q&A. We've had a few questions coming through in the chat, a lot focused towards veganism and kind of the idea of shifting towards a diet that involves less meat. I think just to sort of sum up a few of them, what would a vegan diet typically look like for a general consumer, and how realistic do you think here in the UK it would be to have, what proportion of people do you think can conceivably shift towards that diet?
Well, in terms of what it looks like, that will vary a little bit depending on where you are in the world and the kind of things that you're used to eating, and also what your goals are. So if you're looking for the kind of maximum health benefits, then you would be looking for more of a whole foods vegan diet. So lots of pulses, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds. If you're kind of just looking to replace what you're currently eating, then there are a whole range of kind of meat alternatives, cheese alternatives, dairy alternatives that you could sort of switch around. And I guess I would say for anyone interested in those sorts of shifts, I would just say experiment. There are a lot of products available, and you might not necessarily like the first ones that you try. So it's really important to actually just have some sampling and until you basically land on something that you like. And the other question about how much, I mean, that's a really tricky one. I guess the Committee on Climate Change in their last recommendations estimated that by 2050, around 20% of the population would no longer be eating meat, which that's just kind of based on a projection of current trends, how things are looking. But of course, there are lots of different things that could happen to accelerate that up to 2050. And if it was just 20% by 2050, that's really not going to make the sort of emissions reduction or the land use saving that we need by that point in time. So I think it's really difficult to forecast how this would actually project forward on its own, just kind of under a consumer trends left to their own devices sort of thing, which I don't actually think is very likely. I think we were already seeing some major corporations such as Tesco really increasing their offerings, and just kind of those changes to the food environment are really difficult to predict, which makes it difficult to kind of forecast how consumers will change their purchasing habits going forward. So yeah, not very helpful, I'm afraid. It's a bit of a question mark.
That's fine. No, thank you. Just again, one more on veganism. A few of our commenters were concerned about the price of these products in supermarkets. Do you think there's a need for further pressure to be placed upon supermarkets to offer a larger range of more affordable vegan choices? And do you think that maybe a lot of our individual choices could be changed with better communication?
Yeah, I mean, in that very brief recommendations part at the end, I mentioned the food availability and accessibility, and I really was trying to emphasize there this kind of price issue. Some of the alternatives are sort of more expensive than their animal product alternatives or what they're trying to replace, and I think that is definitely an issue. But that applies more to the kind of processed food side of things. If we look at sort of commodities, then beans, whole grains, I mean, these are some of the cheapest foods around. So again, it really kind of depends on what we're talking about and what sort of dietary profile and which sort of foods we're consuming. But if you did want to sort of eat more plant-based and really minimize the cost, then I would definitely say go for more of the pulses and whole grains rather than the processed foods, which are currently more or can be more expensive. I think Tesco have just introduced a lower price point range of plant-based. I imagine that other retailers will follow suit at some point.
Thank you.
And then there was another part of that question, wasn't there?
Just about our own individual habits, if it comes down to a communication issue, whether that could be presented more clearly.
Yeah, I think so. I think the University of Oxford have just started a food labelling trial to actually see how effective giving that sort of information at the point of purchase is for consumers. I think there's a lot of things. Again, I think it's going to be a bit of a time lead-in period required. So how do we communicate what those labels mean? It kind of requires some background level of knowledge to be able to understand how to really interpret those labels. So I think there's sort of a natural time frame around that anyway. But I also think, like, we've just seen two documentaries from David Attenborough where they're really starting to talk about these issues to a general kind of public audience as well. So we're sort of having more of a background level of information coming up now through society, which I think is really helpful. So yeah, I think it is definitely important in terms of how we communicate, and even communicating that in the first place, which is still quite lacking. But I guess you could probably say that for a lot of issues in this area, not just related to food.
Excellent, thank you. Claire Malcolmson asks, would planting Miyawaki forests be a more rapid way of doing this? I believe referring to the restoration of biodiversity. She says they're incredibly good for biodiversity and take up much less space and can be planted in towns and small plots of land. Do you have any familiarity with Miyawaki forests?
No, I don't actually. What was it? A Miyawaki forest?
Yeah, so Claire Malcolmson asks, Claire, if you could maybe elaborate on that point.
Yeah, please.
Just to go to Margaret Beasley as well, she asks what the impact of green roofs and green walls could be in our urban environments.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. That's not something that we measured, but definitely worth looking at. And really helps as well to kind of connect. So one of the really important things, connecting those ecosystems together. So right now we have the sort of canals and train networks as being some of the major sort of connecting routes for wildlife. So we need to also bear that in mind. So how do we connect urban spaces to some of these more kind of rural areas that we're talking about rewilding? So that could be a really good way to do that, but it's not something I've looked at personally.
Pam Rosling asks about the vast areas of private estates that are burned off for the shooting of game birds, and also the effect of carbon sequestration if peat cutting was banned and peatlands to be restored. Is there any knowledge that you have on those?
So the grouse moor issue definitely would be quite a big area of land. We didn't include that in our analysis because it falls outside of the agricultural land remit that we was looking at, but definitely an important one to include in a more kind of comprehensive land use analysis. I think that could be really important actually to look at those areas as well.
Some difficult questions. I think that that a lot of these are have got people thinking about areas outside of this agricultural land use as well. Just a personal one coming from an ocean background, studying ocean science. Do you have any sort of opinion on blue carbon and the use of carbon sequestration techniques offshore?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the research is quite limited on blue carbon, but there's one really brilliant analysis by, I think it's Atwood et al., published a few years ago. And what they found is blue carbon, it looks really promising. So it actually sequesters carbon around 40 times faster than tropical rainforests. So if we bear in mind this really kind of urgent time frame again, actually blue carbon could be really promising in that respect to basically remove emissions from the atmosphere much more quickly. There's also a really interesting link with biodiversity there. So what we're seeing in the oceans is some of the really important vegetation around the coastline, such as seagrasses and mangroves, are actually being really severely decimated by herbivorous fish populations. And these herbivorous fish populations are basically being allowed to flourish because their natural predators are actually being removed by us in the form of fishing. So we see this really unbalanced ecosystem in the ocean and this kind of trophic cascade impact where we remove the predators and the herbivores are actually decimating all of that blue carbon that we really, really need. So there's also a major kind of food shift scenario to look at in the oceans as well. So if we basically reduce our consumption of fish, then we would allow these natural trophic cascades, the predator and herbivorous populations to be in check and then actually allow for this really important coastal vegetation to re-establish. So it's really interesting, and it's definitely something I'd love to look at more in the future, and a really key part. And I think you're absolutely right that we should look kind of across different ecosystems and land uses and not just focus on the examples that I presented. So that's really just one kind of subset of what we need to be looking at.
Thank you. We're coming up to 5 o'clock now. Just as a quick, Claire's got back to us, just mentioning that Miyawaki forests are actually a Japanese form of biodiversity. And so there we go, something to look at. If we have any opportunity to speak to you for longer, and anyone has any questions that they'd like to address, Ed, if you've got any yourself as well. But I'd just like to say from a personal perspective, this has been a wonderful talk. It's been brilliant, incredibly enthusiastic as well. And it's been excellent to hear from you, Helen. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. And if anyone wants to follow up, I did leave my email address at the end there, so feel free to get in touch. And yeah, just thanks everyone for your interest in this topic. I appreciate it.
Thank you.